resilience is that inner strength that helps you move forward in times of adversity. And one factor that affects our mental health is just what we're going through right now, and resilience. And as men, we often give a bit of little attention to our mental health. It's something that we might make sure we shave, we might make sure we get up in the morning, go for showers and stuff like that. But mental health is something that we can often give little attention to, and to think in our culture that it's a bit of a sign of a weakness and a bit of a taboo topic to talk about. And as a result, us men can often bottle up our feelings, increasing the risk of depression and anxiety. And the stats are quite confronting. 6 out of every 8 suicides in Australia are men, um, which is quite a shocking statistic. And we have a greater incidence of violence and anger and addictive behaviour. So we're going to explore that today in our session with our panel. And I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker today. We've got Dr. Andrew GAN to share his own personal story with mental health, and his journey. For those who don't know who Andrew is, he's been a member of our church for over 10 years. He grew up in Singapore and moved to Melbourne to commence university studies after high school. And he's courageously agreed to share his journey with mental health issues, so it can be a benefit to all of us. So I'll let Andrew share more about himself. So please make him feel welcome. And Andrew, I'll pass it over to you. Great, thank you. Maybe just give you some time to share your screen. There we go. Perfect, thank you very much.
Unmute. Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, my name's Andrew. For those of you who don't know me, thanks for the introduction, Adrian. And I've got just a couple of slides to show you, just to introduce myself before I proceed on with my story. So, as Adrian mentioned before, I grew up in Singapore. I moved to Melbourne about 19 years ago, I think. Let's see if this works. Come on. There. That's a picture of me and my live group in happier times. I think it was Christmas party last year when we could still gather in crowds and meet in groups of more than 5. There we go. Some pictures of my family. So I'm married to my wife Sam. Some of you might have seen her around church. We live in Rowville with our 2 sons Ben and Alex. We're now 5 years old and 2 years old, and we've got 2 pet rabbits as well. There were 3 in some pictures, but unfortunately one of them passed away. So I work as a general practitioner. It's me in various settings. I on a mission trip on the right side to the Philippines, and on the left side in my full PPE, going out swabbing patients for COVID. My free time, I've got a few different hobbies when I do get around to it. So latest is putting up, getting an Instagram account, taking lots of photos, working on cooking, gardening, enjoy a bit of running and swimming when I get around to doing it, when I get a bit of free time. So that's a bit of myself. I grew up in a Christian household, and I spent most Sundays in church since my childhood. Since a young age, I was driven to perfection in my studies and my work. I was always comparing myself to my peers and push myself to do better and better. It's typical Singaporean kiasu mentality. I was constantly worried and anxious about my future. And as part of my university training, we learned about depression. I scored myself against CHEN, which is a questionnaire designed to assess mental distress, and scored about 45 out of 50, indicating severe levels of mental distress. However, I've been feeling that way for most of my life and somehow managed to cope and get through, so I disregarded this finding. Came across this on Instagram, reminded me that I was getting too caught up in things that don't matter or shouldn't matter. As I entered the workforce and commenced working in a major hospital about 12 years ago, the stress grew. People around me were constantly reminding me that any mistake I made could cost someone their life. There were financial pressures, pressures to climb the career ladder. I was working such long hours, night shifts, that all I could do on my occasional days off was to catch up on much needed sleep. I would drive to work early in the morning, sit in my car, and just cry every day for several weeks. And a picture from one of my friends who put it on Facebook. describing what anxiety can feel like. It can really sit deep down inside you, and even when you're asleep, anxiety doesn't quite go away; it just flows into your brain and other parts of you. Eventually, I became so stressed that I regularly began thinking of taking my own life. During my drive to and from work on Wellington Road, I wondered about what if I lost control of the wheel and ended things, but also realized I might end up harming someone else in the process. I didn't know where to go to or who to turn to for help back then. And people around me seemed to be in the same shoes. God provided the right person at the right time. One day I spoke to my boss at work, Dr. Dennis Angler, in Monash Medical Center, in private about what I was going through, and he was really supportive and arranged for me to see his psychiatrist colleague the very next day. Saw the psychiatrist who started me on antidepressant medication and advised me to take 4 weeks sick leave from work straight away. Over the next 2 years, I continued to see a psychiatrist as well as psychologist for counseling. I continued taking antidepressants. Eventually, the good days started outnumbering the bad days. I had a number of supportive bosses and colleagues who helped me arrange time off when I needed to and lighten my workloads on the days I couldn't cope. Some had been through depression and shared their own journey with me. It astounded me that a good Christian like this, that this could happen to me. I regularly attended and served in church. I went for cell group meetings. I did my daily quiet time, and yet I could not escape this. Praying and claiming God's promises did not make the dark thoughts or stress disappear altogether. Through all this, one thing God revealed to me was that even if I never read His Word, even if I never attended church or prayed to Him, none of that would change His love for me. None of that could take away His mercy and forgiveness towards me. That's how much He loves me. God also taught me through this experience to be more compassionate and patient towards other people who are facing their own internal struggles. At the present, I still have good and bad days. Anyone who is a parent knows unpredictable days, sleep-deprived nights are a frequent occurrence. I'm very fortunate to have the best wife in the world who cares for me unconditionally. She reminds me to take rest when I'm sleep-deprived, to go back and see my psychologist when I'm not doing well, to lighten my workload and commitments when they are too much, to worry less and leave the future in God's hands. I know to seek professional help if I could get worse because I know I can't fix myself. In the light of the current COVID pandemic, I found myself struggling a lot more than usual. Stage 4 restrictions in Melbourne that have stopped social activities that I used to take for granted, like face-to-face church attendance or even gym that is open. The uncertainty that every day brings. As a healthcare practitioner, I constantly worry that I may be exposed to or might contract COVID or even pass it to my family members. I worry about not having sufficient personal protective equipment at work. I worry about my patients who are sick or unwell this year, knowing that healthcare services and hospital services are severely restricted or even unavailable. The guilt that I'm not being the best husband to my wife or the best father to my children. Seldom anything positive in the daily news bulletins. While going through this difficult time during the pandemic, I want to share some tips or advice on what has been helpful battling depression during COVID. First is expressing gratitude. So trying to take comfort in the little things, being able to come home to my wife and kids, the blessing of still having a roof over our heads, presence of an almighty God who is still in control in the midst of all this. So number 2, getting professional help. I've been back to see my GP and I've restarted on antidepressants this year. I took a few weeks off work in July and I've taken a bit of more time off this month. I've been seeing my psychologist every 3 weeks for the past few months, and the good days are slowly beginning to outnumber the bad days. Number 3, exercising, breathing, and being mindful of God. Simple things that initially seemed insignificant are starting to help. Activity scheduling, so starting each day with a short jog outdoors. Deep breathing. Praying before the start of each work shift and after any challenging times. Remembering the things to be thankful to God for. Number 4, being connected to others and sharing the load. So being able to watch church on YouTube every week, being able to see my life group members at Zoom meetings, being able to hang out with other brothers at church and power meetings as we are doing right now. I've been really supported by friends such as Joe Chen, who's been calling me frequently to check on my welfare and offer to pray for me as well. And that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing. That's really powerful, your testimony, and I think it's what it does for me. It actually just shows that we're still in it. It doesn't mean that once we've gone through it, it's the end. But things like mental health and resilience is something it's something that needs to be ongoing. And like you were saying about, for me, when you were sharing about the fears of sharing COVID and with personal protection equipment, that's something that I've never had to deal with before, but I can understand why, you'd be so concerned about that. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And I think what you mentioned about meeting together and making that time and effort to spend time with other brothers and sisters in Christ, through church sermons and in this empower meeting as well. I think that's really, really awesome that we can play that role and be a part. So everyone, just if you see Andrew, or if you get to have a chance to chat to him, really just thank him for sharing today, because that was really powerful. So thank you so much, Andrew. Yeah, really great sharing. We're going to move on to our next speaker today, which is our main speaker today, which is Dr. Danny Cheah. And he's no stranger to Clayton now, which has been really awesome, again, as I mentioned before, to have him just share his wisdom. And today he's going to be sharing specifically on men's mental health with regards to us guys. For those who don't know Danny and might be hearing for the first time, I'll just give a bit of an intro to him. So Dr. Danny Cheah is a child and adolescent psychiatrist working as the head of clinical services at the Alfred Hospital, Child and Youth Mental Health Service in Melbourne. He leads about 70 mental health professionals and also provides clinical supervision and teaching. He also delivers lectures on adolescent development and adolescent depression for the University of Melbourne in the Master of Psychiatry course. He's a Christian and he attends Numa Church in Melbourne. Danny's absolutely passionate about helping people early in order to prevent long-term consequences of mental health illnesses. He delivers mental health talks tailored for the general public to help reduce the stigma associated with mental health issues through improved understanding of the topic. He also has conducted seminars geared towards teachers and parents on promoting resilience in children and young people. And he has facilitated workshops focused on specific skills and self-care for carers and families dealing with the ripple effects of mental health issues. So I'd love to pass it over to Danny. Again, Dr. Danny, thank you so much for your time, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks for having me, everyone. And I'm glad I can join you all from wherever you are, in your living room or your kitchen or your kids' room or the toilet or wherever you're hiding in your house. Yeah, I've had an opportunity to obviously speak, I think, in the main service, I think a couple of months back, and did some training for the leaders. Before I get into the talk a little bit more, I just really want to just pause and really acknowledge Andrew's story and that your generosity in sharing your lived experience of what you've been through and your testimony, because really that's actually, if we look at the different things that help men's mental health, that is the one thing that makes the biggest difference, really, around people speaking up about their experience, about their journey, and really that's the most powerful message, really, in terms of encouraging people to get help and having addressing issues about stigma and reducing the fear around and the fear and myths around mental health issues. So I didn't want to kind of skim past that, because I think that's absolutely significant. So in some ways the magic's already done, not from what I'm going to share really, but actually what you've modeled through sharing your story, that your bravery and your generosity. And I really, Andrew, I believe that your story is going to help so many people. It's going to touch so many lives. It will give purpose and meaning to the suffering that you went through, and also the testimony of your victory in Christ as well, both from a spiritual as well as in a very practical way too. So I really thank you for your journey and your story. And I think sometimes when we read through, when we hear a story like that, we move past into the success and the practical things afterwards. Similarly, when we read a lot of the stories in the Bible of challenges and adversity, we very quickly kind of go, well, this happened, and then the glory of God was revealed, or something. But actually, if you read through the scriptures and a journey of the people in the Bible, it comes through significant adversity, challenges, persecution, that goes on for not just moments. Sometimes it takes 10 seconds to read through a passage, but sometimes that 10-second reading of the passage represents people's experience and journey and challenges over years, decades, centuries, generations. So I just really wanted to really parallel that with Andrew's story around his journey of, which was really rich, and he with such a succinct and clear presentation and story, but there was just so much in there really that I really encourage you, in terms of being able to watch this recording, to go back to that and just to process that a little bit more, because that's an absolute game changer in terms of this area. I got started doing talks like this really from helping through a friend of mine who was a pastor back in Malaysia. That's where I'm from originally. I moved to Australia to study like Andrew, and then stayed on and did further training and got into mental health. And through my connections with the pastors back home, and then through some NGOs, I've been able to do talks like this, really around promoting mental health and getting people to think about things like anxiety, depression, getting help, and then particularly addressing issues around stigma within the church context. And one of the things I'm going to share my screen and get into it, so that you can perhaps have some images to help us kind of remember what we're talking about today, rather than my face, because I think the images might be more helpful than remembering my face. So I've been using this hashtag called "Don't Just Pray It Away," really as a encouragement. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened to the text, but there is a Y at the end of "away." It's really an encouragement for us to do two things. One, to actually speak up and seek practical help for the things that we need help for. And the second thing really is for us as a church community to be prepared to disciple people who might be struggling with mental health issues and conditions. We know that throughout a person's life, really 1 in 4 people will struggle with a mental health difficulty within their lifetime. So within our church, your church congregation, your community, you would expect that at least 1 in 4 people would be struggling with a mental health condition sometime in their life, and actually 2/3 of people actually don't get the help that they need. And the main issues relate to fear, stigma, and particularly for the church context, I think there can be an incredible amount of fear or self-judgment that comes from the sense of, well, if I'm a good Christian, I shouldn't have these difficulties and problems. And I think I addressed some of this through the general talk that I gave to the church, but I just want to recap a couple of things before we get into the specific issues around men's mental health. And that is that we live in the fallen world because of sin, that everything in this world that is broken due to the suffering that we have comes from the broken nature of the world that we live in, and the brokenness of our humanity, and when suffering was introduced into the world, sometimes we can over attribute certain things in mental health to say a specific situation that could be due to a curse or demonic possession, and various other judgments that we might place on things that are related to our mental health, and that can actually make it very difficult or really fearful in terms of for people to actually get help, particularly when they're Christians. And what I want to say to that really is that things that are spiritual and psychological can actually occur together, and the spirituality relates to the brokenness of man, and that results in psychological and physical consequences in terms of our health outcomes. This is why, unfortunately, people struggle with cancer, illness, and diabetes, and a whole range of mental health health conditions. And mental health conditions, like health conditions, are part of the brokenness of the world that we live in. And I think this is really important because it's sort of a joke, but not really that funny. In that, in amongst my colleagues and other mental health professionals, sometimes it can be very tricky to work with patients who are Christians because of this issue of stigma that people may feel like they just want to pray the problem away, and that if you don't pray it away, somehow that you're not as faithful. So I would premise it by really saying it's important that our prayers, our first response in every single situation, to bring all our needs to God. But it's really important to remember that the things that are good in this world, whether it's the medicine, practical help, all the things, psychological help, things that are good, is a result of a manifestation of God's character and through his creation. So that it's really important for us to be able to access the things that are good and available for us. When we think about men's mental health, we really can't separate out issues around men's health and men's mental health, because they actually go hand in hand together. And looking after our mental health also involves looking after our physical health, whether it's making sure that we are doing the right things in terms of, I don't have to tell you what they are, but in terms of our exercise, diet, routines, and so forth, and actually kind of making sure that we are engaged in regular health checks when we need to, seeing someone like Andrew or one of your GPs in terms of regular health checks, especially at different stages of our life, because the issues around physical health that affect us as men can actually significantly also affect our mental health. I won't go into the details of that, but really making sure that we're screening for, with the right advice, screening for various conditions and diseases, so that we don't, so we get help early for those conditions, so that they don't cause longer term problems in our life, which then affects our ability to manage our day-to-day activities, and then that affects our mental health. So looking after our physical health is a really good place to start in terms of thinking about our mental health. I'm not going to spend too much time really talking about this list. You can really go onto a lot of men's health websites and get a list of things that are helpful for mental health. I want to spend a bit more time later on really talking about some of the deeper issues that I think that we face as men. Typically, we know that we know that in terms of mental health problems, particularly serious issues such as suicide, it is much more common in men than in women, as what Adrian described earlier. And previously, this was kind of attributed to that men aren't very good at speaking up and getting help. Fortunately, through improved messaging, that narrative has changed. So it's really important that, I think, while we acknowledge that it might be difficult for men to actually speak up about getting help, this narrative has changed in that more and more men and women are actually getting help equally, which is an absolutely important thing. So as part of reducing the stigma or the reluctance for men to get help, it's also important for us to change our messaging to say that actually it's normal for men to speak up about their mental health and to get help when they need to. So it's really important that we normalize that, and that becomes part of our day-to-day life, so that it doesn't become a barrier. In terms of men and women and boys and girls, typically perhaps we may see women or girls presenting with things like anxiety, depression more, but men or boys presenting with more issues relating to alcohol and drinking and gambling, as well as perhaps issues around anger and violence. And perhaps, look, we could perhaps speculate a lot of different things around gender stereotypes and various other philosophical discussions around perhaps why some of those differences might be the case. But really, it's a representation that there are different ways of manifesting distress. Sometimes it is through words and emotional experiences. Sometimes it is through our thoughts, and the way that our thoughts might be tormenting us, or it could actually be through certain behaviors or things that we do, such as making impulsive decisions, dealing with issues of anger, aggression, and violence, or perhaps using external things to help us cope with our mental health, such as alcohol and other drugs, or even things like gambling. Sometimes we sort of see them as perhaps a list of different problems, but it's important to realize that perhaps on the surface, they are a range of different things that we do to try and cope, whether it's healthy or unhealthy. The function of some of those behaviors is really to help us perhaps cope with some of the internal distress and turmoil. And I spoke about physical health being a very significant part of that. The other area that's a common myth really is that eating disorders is more common in women, and that might be the case statistically, but also to acknowledge that is a significant problem that occurs in men that perhaps also manifests differently. So ranging from seeking issues around body image, around wanting to be thin, but particularly for men, it could be actually a preoccupation with perhaps muscle mass and lean muscles and wanting to be healthy, for example. But the preoccupation could be at a point where it's detrimental to our health and has a significant impact on our day-to-day life. Look, I didn't want to spend too much time on this, except to highlight that these are some examples of perhaps how mental health issues might manifest in men. So alcohol and drinking, gambling, maybe eating problems, a lack of attention to our physical health, a manifestation of behavioral difficulties, perhaps more than necessarily what seems emotional, but they are all very strongly linked. And one of the areas that I think it's particularly important for us to think about is that how do we actually develop better coping skills so that we don't rely on some of these other ways of managing our thoughts and our feelings and emotions so that we manage them in perhaps healthier ways. I'm going to speak to a really key issue, and if your attention span is like mine, and after a while hearing someone talk, you start to drift off, that's pretty normal. It's not because you're a bad person or you're not paying attention. That's actually just a normal attention span. So if you just spend the next couple of minutes really focus on this bit, because I think this is the crucial bit that apart from obviously hearing Andrew's story, this is the bit that I think if we get our head around this concept or idea, it will help us unpack or work out some of the other more practical principles. And I'm happy to speak to this a little bit further when we have the question and answer period as well. When we think about mental health issues, I would often, in terms of a professional perspective, see that mental health issues arise at times when we experience a significant amount of change in our lives, whether it may be perhaps arrival of a child, as Adrian shared, whether it's a significant change in your relationship status, such as going through divorce or a death of a partner, going through financial stressors, relocation, retirement, various things that kind of leads to isolation and loneliness. And those are often the trigger points of which mental health issues might actually kind of arise. It's not necessarily the cause, but perhaps a bit of a trigger point. And you may kind of wonder, why are those events so significant in terms of making someone vulnerable to developing mental health difficulties or challenges? I guess it goes back to what the function of those events or situations would be, rather than the events being the causal problem. So for example, losing a loved one or going through financial stress, that alone actually isn't the direct pathway to actually cause mental health problems. The pathway through which those events cause mental health problems is through the impact and effect on someone's reputation. And this is, whether it is about the changes in your circumstances with work, finances, and so forth, all those things that affect our sense of reputation and our standing, whether it's in your family or as a person, even perhaps how you see yourself or in society, that often becomes the most perhaps the point at which that we might be the most vulnerable. And I relate this biblically through the passage in Genesis, where we read that Adam and Eve, when they sinned, they realized they were naked and sewed fig leaves to make coverings for themselves, to cover the sense of nakedness and shame. And now I use that as a metaphor to understand, in terms of those fig leaves can be understood in terms of all the other things that we have in our day-to-day life, such as our career, our finances, our relationships and where we stand in terms of our relationships, our achievements, our connections, our property, and a whole heap of other things that we might have. And all those things are good things in our life. They often things that God has blessed us with in terms of our day-to-day lives, and we are very thankful for what God has given to us in all those areas. But all those things are also they're a bit like the fig leaves that actually cover our nakedness and shame, such that through the ups and downs of life, when things happen through the losses and change and transitions, it causes those fig leaves to fall, that the things that we have around us drop off or change, exposing us to this sense of fear and shame and nakedness. And that's at a point at which we would struggle the most, or be the most vulnerable in terms of mental health difficulties. And this goes back to kind of something really important for us to think about, that at various crucial points of crises or challenges, it causes us to reflect on our identity, our sense of self-worth, who we are, what does God think about me, and a whole range of other types of situations or questions that they get brought up during these particular crises. And sometimes when we are struggling with a very significant mental health problem, such as anxiety or depression, and I'll speak to that a little bit more, but as what Andrew was describing earlier, that sometimes those mental health conditions can affect the way that we see ourselves and affect the way that we think God sees us. So sometimes when people are going through significant mental health problems, it can also affect our spirituality and also our theology in terms of how we interpret various things. We might be reading something in the Bible that is perhaps intended for the purpose of conviction that brings change and life and redemption. Sometimes when we might be struggling through, say, depression or other mental health conditions, it would cause us to interpret those passages with a sense of judgment and fear, which is not the heart of the Father heart of God in terms of his intention for his word for us. And so there's many things that we have to kind of grapple with during these points in that journey, but also throughout our lives, in terms of really discovering and working out what is our identity and what informs our identity. Is it the things that we own, the clothes that we wear, the hobbies that we have, what kind of football team that we go for? And this is particularly important for men with regards to the stereotypes that men have to contend with in terms of what makes somebody a man. And it may be kind of culturally driven. It could be different in different societies, different subgroups, or even in a church culture. Are we valued and important because we are successful in our career, in our money, in our finances, for example? Or is it because that we have certain hobbies and interests? So, for example, you're a man if you perhaps barrack for a particular football club, and you go to this particular pub every day to hang out with your mates, and or that perhaps the success of being a man comes from having a wife and 3 kids and a house with 2 car park garage and land. And there's so many different things that perhaps can inform our identity as men. It's really important for us to really go back to understanding what truly informs our identity. And that really comes from knowing that we are a child of God and he loves us unconditionally, that we are made in his image, and that our identity is informed by the way that he sees us in the redeemed in the redeemed form. So while we are broken and we have redemption and justification and transformation, God sees us differently from the way that we see our own frailties and imperfections, and God really sees past all that because of the love of Christ and what He has done on the cross for us. So it's really important for us to be able to reflect and be focused and know from God's word about what He sees, the way He sees us, rather than have our identity informed by the circumstances that are around in our life. And there are many things that, which is why this goes back to in terms of a prevention perspective, for us to be constantly grappling with what informs our identity, and to be able to have things in our life that is quite balanced in terms of what our priorities might be. So while all the things are listed above, in terms of the things that we own, reputation and so forth, are important, it's really important to be able to have a balanced perspective of that, so that then we are not completely vulnerable when we go through the ups and downs in life. One of the things God has really shown me, and I've had to grapple with various things along the way, and in terms of dealing with it, perhaps stress and anxiety, and having to really work out what are my priorities, what's really most important in my life, and being challenged with that. And that's a whole other long story. But one of the things that I think most recently I've been journeying with, and what I've learned through perhaps from some of my pastors, and also some of the books that I've been reading around spirituality and wholeness, really is around not just doing our day-to-day kind of Christian practices, as in terms of going to church, reading the Bible, remaining faithful in our giving and community, and remaining connected. One of the areas that I'm getting better at doing, particularly in this lockdown situation, is the area of actually practicing the Sabbath. The Sabbath isn't just a day of rest and restoration, but it's been designed so that we get into a regular rhythm where we have a day that we produce nothing, and know that God loves us even on a day that we don't produce anything whatsoever. So we can be very focused and outcome-driven, performance-driven sort of society, and we can do all sorts of things, such as I think a couple of people mentioned around rest, balance, exercise, mindfulness, and so forth. But one of the key things that has helped me in my life really is to be able to put that Sabbath practice in my day-to-day life. Obviously, I'm not getting it 100% right, but I am making that a focus, and it requires quite a lot of intentionality around making that happen, particularly if you're in ministry, you've got a family, there's a whole heaps of other challenges, career-wise, you're working shift work, working more than 5 days a week, for example, and there's other kind of challenges. So this is not about a legalism, but you have to, if you don't do this, then therefore, there's a sense of judgment around it, but really about trying to think about how do we, I'm journeying on that in terms of how do I put that in practice in my life, because it's really helped to reshape some of the priorities in my life, and being able to have a constant rhythmic reminder for myself, because it's so easy to fall into a trap of a busy life and a performance-driven society and culture, to know that God loves me even on a day that I don't produce anything whatsoever. The other area that is really significant, I think, for men, is we don't cope with loneliness very well. And this is particularly why there are perhaps time or stages in life where this is particularly an issue, with perhaps going through, say, like a family separation, or a death of a spouse, or even going through different stages, such as when your children move out of home, or perhaps going through retirement, or changes in jobs, or job losses, and so forth. And this is also an issue that has become even more significant during this lockdown period, where a lot of our sort of social connections have been disconnected, and this is perhaps a point of vulnerability for us as men, and making sure that we perhaps pay attention to perhaps building relationships on a regular basis in a whole range of different situations, that helps reduce our sense of vulnerability to this particular area, expecting that there are different transitions or stages in life that this will affect us more than others. So, for example, we tend to want to connect with people that have similar hobbies with us, similar philosophies and ideas and interests. So we often try and look for people who are like ourselves. And my joke to with my colleagues sometimes is that, you know, if we try really hard to look for someone who's like ourselves, then we might actually not end up liking them. But it's really important for us to actually be open to a whole range of different friendships, networks, and relationships. We don't really need to be living in each other's pockets all the time to form connection. But it's about making sure we have meaningful and close connections, or people that kind of help encourage us, and both spiritually, physically, and emotionally, but also being able to have that in different settings in our lives. Typically, if we invest all our relationships in one setting, and through the ups and downs of life, it's inevitable there will be challenges in relationships. Conflict is part of life. And sometimes when things are uncomfortable, we tend to retreat and remove ourselves from those situations. If all our relationships center around one place, then when there is a change in that environment or that situation or a problem in that area, it perhaps leaves us vulnerable in so many other areas. So it's really thinking about how do we invest in a balance of different relationships across different aspects of our life, whether it's your church family, your connect or life group, your ministry area, your own extended family, your work colleagues, your neighbors, your local kind of football club or other sporting interests, and having a range of different things that we engage in, and sometimes doing things that we don't perhaps enjoy the most, with the primary aim of actually making connection and community. And that is so important, because I think sometimes we might kind of get preoccupied with perhaps the activity rather than the focus on relationships. So for example, I've heard a few people talk about fishing early on. Look, I'm not particularly into fishing, but I actually went fishing with a few friends a couple of times, and I'm happy to go with somebody just to join in. Really, to be honest, so I don't offend anybody, I can't see the point of sitting there for 3 hours, and maybe perhaps it was my fishing skill. I didn't get anything, but my friend certainly did. But it's not the point. It's really about being able to give it a go and trying different things. If there's something organized by the church, just join in. It doesn't have to be the activity that you love the most or you're particularly good at. And often we may be reluctant to actually join in an activity because we feel like we're not good at it. So for example, I caught no fish the last 8 times I went fishing. So I might kind of think, oh, I'm going to look really bad going fishing with people who are very good at fishing, and there's a sense of comparison around that. But it's really important we push past that and to do things that we sometimes don't enjoy, or that we're not particularly good at, for the purpose of connection and relationships. And this is how perhaps we are able to work through some of the challenges that makes us vulnerable in terms of finding friendships and connections. Because I've heard from people, it's really hard to be with other people, it's hard to connect, I feel left out and so forth. So I just really encouragement for some practical tips about how we might navigate some of those different parts of our life and in relationships. And particularly if you've got a young family as well, and perhaps obviously your kids and your leading a family, has comes with many challenges and expectations, and being able to also invest in some relationships outside the family. Obviously not every day, because you've got other commitments and so forth, but even once a month, catching up with a mate or someone else outside your immediate family, so you've got that kind of outlet and support, and making that a bit of a priority and rhythm in our day-to-day lives. I'm going to cover a couple of very common mental health challenges for all people, but including men. So really, depression refers to perhaps a change in our thinking, feeling, and in behavior, leading to perhaps a state of withdrawal, problems with not wanting to perhaps eat, not wanting to do things that we enjoy, getting quite withdrawn. And this could go on for actually weeks and months sometimes. And also at the peak of that, we can perhaps be retreated to a point of feeling hopeless, feeling worthless, feeling guilty over a whole range of different things, and that sometimes even trying to kind of problem solve our situations, we remain very stuck in that particular mindset. And that could be a sign of actually depression as well, rather than just feeling sad because of a circumstantial situation. And also sometimes when people feel depressed, as Andrew shared, that you can actually be struggling with losing your will to live, or actually wanting to having thoughts of ending your life. And so really important to be able to seek professional help and reach out to someone that you trust. And maybe you might find it hard to kind of actually go and see a stranger professional, but really start off by actually speaking to anyone that you might trust in your network of family, in your church family, to then and hopefully be able to kind of get support through that person, and that person can help direct you to an appropriate place to get support as well. Sometimes we think about depression manifesting in terms of feeling sad, feeling having negative thoughts and so forth. But very typically, depression can manifest in a form of increased anger, irritability, losing our patience, getting frustrated very easily, getting quite agitated, and also people who struggle with depression might also suffer with very significant physical symptoms: tummy aches, body aches, tensions, headaches, and a whole range of other health concerns. So sometimes mental health challenges can actually manifest in terms of physical symptoms. And so either way, it's really important. I encourage you to be able to see your GP and get your health checked out if you have any of those problems in your life. Anxiety probably comes anxiety is probably one of the most significant problems that we all might face, and at different and varying degrees. But particularly in terms of our mental health, anxiety is probably one of the most common struggles that we might have. And this isn't just about worrying about things, or perhaps feeling apprehension, a bit nervous. So, for example, fear of public speaking is actually a very common fear, and all of us get anxious in that situation. Now, when I talk about an anxiety disorder, it's very crippling anxiety to the point where you can't get out of bed, you can't face the world. You find it hard to get out of the house, you can't do your job, you find it really hard to meet expectations, and sometimes that can actually lead to very devastating consequences in terms of not being able to do things and be able to manage the things in our day-to-day life, and that then compounds on our ability to actually perhaps feel that we are productive or successful, and then that perhaps can also lead to a sense of demoralization. Anxiety and depression are very strongly connected. Often it starts off with perhaps a sense of anxiety and fear. Fear in terms of perhaps if you drill down to a lot of situations where people suffer from anxiety, it leads back to what I spoke about earlier around identity and reputation. And fear of judgment, fear of meeting expectations, fear of getting someone's approval, whether it's your spouse or your family, or the people around you, or your peers, or even your own sense of approval, which often comes from perhaps feeling like you're not meeting your parents' expectations. And some of those feelings can actually haunt us throughout our lives sometimes. And the struggle to meet expectations can lead to this sense of anxiety and fear. Anxiety and fear then will lead to some natural responses, such as retreat and withdrawal. And that sense of retreat and withdrawal can lead to perhaps avoiding the things that we have to do, or the things that we have to face. And then through that, we also avoid the things that we enjoy doing. And that then leads to a sense of demoralization and a sense of failure, which then brings on depression. So I think anxiety and depression often happen they often come together, and they often perhaps one might also precede the other as well. And so while there are practical things that we need to do in terms of perhaps maintaining healthy routines in the first place, having a clear sense of a redeemed perspective of how we see ourselves as people, our sense of identity, and being able to have a good perhaps balance in our life in terms of how we prioritize the things in our life. But also making sure that sometimes at certain points when things get really bad, to the point where you I guess somehow, meet the threshold of suffering from a mental health difficulty, it's really important to get some professional help, like what Andrew highlighted in terms of it isn't always medication. Often the first line is getting some psychological help and counseling to help work through some of those problems, but also medication can be a very effective way to help through the process of journey and recovery. And generally doing both actually perhaps is the most effective process. So there are things that we can do at a very practical level as a community, as individuals, as Christians. But then there's also times when we need to get that professional help to treat at a point where it reaches a threshold of significant mental health problems like anxiety and depression. And being able to get that help also means that then we are then better able to put in place the things like the routines and getting a clear perspective of our spirituality and so forth, so that then both those interventions are really important in terms of putting those two areas in place in our life so that we can get the best outcome in terms of our recovery. In terms of mental health issues in men, often this might manifest in a sense of kind of violence, and sometimes we think of violence in a very black and white way in terms of whether it's good or bad behavior. What I'm not making excuses for violence, but I just really want to drill down to an understanding of kind of what drives some of those challenging behaviors, such as violence, so that there's an awareness of it. Sometimes we associate violence with, for example, psychopaths, so that people are violent because they're bad people. But in a majority of situations, violence is actually a form of a very maladaptive or poor coping mechanism to deal with certain situations and problems. And what is often underlying that violence is a sense of fear that can't be acknowledged and processed. So if you're somebody who struggles with anger and with the point of dealing with violence, it's really important to get that right help, because it's not just a matter of just telling somebody not to be violent, but actually drilling down to things that might be driving that. And often it comes to being able to deal with different emotions such as fear and sadness, as well as anger. This is an iceberg, which perhaps depicts that a little bit in terms of thinking about what we might be seeing in the surface. Could be anger, frustration, irritability. And what is actually underlying some of the behaviors that we see on the surface could actually be driven by a sense of sadness and fear. I could perhaps speak a bit longer. Maybe I'll see how we go with time, and maybe I can take some more questions if people have more questions about this later on. One example of how this relates is this: sometimes when we are in situations where we are feeling fearful, fear leads to this sense of loss of control. And when we run out of resources to control the situation, the environment around us, sometimes anger or violence becomes that mode of control to deal with that underlying sense of fear. So it's really important to be able to regularly be in a position or place where we are able to give dignity to sadness, and also have a language for fear as well. Being able to say things like, I feel scared, I feel sad. And there's so many other adjectives to describe all the different feelings that we might have. And sometimes we, as men, might kind of struggle with actually putting those things in words, maybe because that we're not used to it. But it starts off with very simple things like actually saying those words: I feel sad, I feel angry, I feel scared. And that could be a starting point in terms of actually doing those things. I think it's really important. I know it feels kind of a bit cliche, artificial, but actually putting that into practice is really important. Writing it down could be another way of doing that as well. And making sure that we actually get used to using these words in terms of our day-to-day vocabulary, so that we're not in a position where we run out of options to be able to express ourselves, and that leads to perhaps unhelpful or dangerous ways of coping. And just linking that with this sense of communication, that a lot of mental health symptoms and difficulties come from perhaps this sense of struggling to actually communicate where we're at in terms of our dilemma and feeling stuck in a particular situation. So learning to be assertive is really important, to be able to express ourselves, express the different emotions that we spoke about, but being able to manage relationships in healthy, assertive ways would be really important. And I remember that I think Pastor Cheah had spoken about healthy boundaries as part of a sermon series earlier. Some of those practical tips are really helpful in terms of putting in place regular and healthy communication and being able to not bank up the things that might make us feel upset and frustrated, but regularly communicating that in appropriate ways, such as through writing and actually talking and so forth. And sometimes some of the ways that helps us to cope sometimes may not necessarily be through verbal communication, through talking. Sometimes it's through doing things, and sometimes in coming together to do things, there's a lot of communication that happens by actually just being together. I don't want to get too much caught up in the stereotype, but this is a common situation where sometimes, perhaps typically, women do better with perhaps face-to-face type communication. So, talking to someone directly face-to-face, and perhaps typically men deal better with side-by-side communication. So sometimes, driving, going for a long drive, fishing, sitting next to each other, doing certain activities that perhaps then allow for better space for talking. And I think it's really important to create those routines in our day-to-day life so we get used to it, but also that then when there are healthy routines that promote communication, then if there were situations that become more challenging, it doesn't become awkward to bring out those difficult situations in terms of getting help. Now, I'm about to finish off really in terms of really emphasizing the importance of community to be able to do all those things that we have spoken about earlier, but making sure that as a community we practice this. And really, I would encourage you in terms of, obviously, I don't know your individual circumstances, but hopefully you would be getting something helpful from the talk today and also from the speakers and their different messages, and actually kind of start thinking about one thing that you can put into practice and maybe kind of continuing these conversations with perhaps the people that you meet or in your groups or wherever contexts that you might be in. And I think sometimes when we perhaps meet up as a community, we can get very intellectualized in terms of thinking about the different ideas that we could be doing and how important, mental health is such an important thing. Men's health is such an important thing. But what I really want to emphasize is really the importance of actually putting something into practice, picking one thing that you're able to put in practice and actually share that with somebody in the community that you trust. There's a couple of things apart from your usual networks and community and people that you trust. Being able to reach out for help. Lifeline is a 24-hour crisis support line that it's really important that we all know this number, 131144, that's available 24 hours a day to have immediate support. The people on the line are perhaps not necessarily trained mental health professionals or doctors like Andrew or myself, but really they are available to be the first responders and to help. And this is available 24 hours a day. And then they can also help support you through a bit of a journey, but also link you up to the right supports as well. For the majority of people across all age groups, your GP is a really important point of contact in terms of looking after both your physical health and your mental health, and making sure that you all have a regular GP that you go to. It'd be perhaps sometimes we might go to see the GP only we've got a cough or cold, and you might go to a clinic where you might just see a different person. But if you can link up with a GP that you actually see on a regular basis, that you have a relationship with, so that when things change or when you go through certain challenges, you've got someone ready to go to as a bit of a support network from a professional perspective, and your GP can help them navigate the next referral point in terms of, say, seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist or any other mental health supports a professional. And often that's funded through the Medicare system as well, and get that support. Headspace is an organization supporting youth ages 12 to 25. So if you're a young person here, always look, you can look up for your local Headspace center to get the help that you might need. I might stop here. I've done a lot of talking, and I think that's just want to pass that back to Adrian, and then I'll jump into the Q&A a little bit later.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There we go. Thank you so much, Danny. That was a lot of information, which was really helpful. And I think especially for me, just in terms of communication, that one really hit me about, just verbalizing, I feel sad, I feel scared. And it's not natural for someone else to do that. But I thought that was really helpful. And just even that one tip, what's one healthy routine that we could start today to have those side-by-side communications with someone that we trust, so that when there is a confronting situation or when we do really need that support, it comes out naturally and it's not this kind of awkward conversation. So really appreciate that sharing, Danny.
Yeah, Adrian, before I forget, I think I sent a little handout with some 8 tips to help us to look after our mental health, and hopefully that might be also helpful to people as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that as well. Yeah, we'll definitely we've sent that out in the email, but we'll also put it back in the chat towards the conclusion of this session. Now, before we move on to our next speaker, we're going to get everyone just to stand up and stretch. So we've been sitting down for a while, and I want to make sure that our physical health is still good as well. So everyone, I want you to stand up, and I'm not sure if you can still see me, but just touch the sky if you can. Yep, touch the sky, stand up, get out of your chair, have your hands to the side. See if you can touch someone else's arms in the Zoom grid view as well. I'm not sure if you can line it up and see. But just wave your arms around. And I saw Colin stretching before, and I was like, that's a really good reminder just to keep stretching and make sure, keep our physical health good as well. And get that blood flowing, because, we spend a lot of time in front of screens, don't we, anyway? So have some good stretching. Awesome. Cool. So our next speaker we've got, I'd love to introduce you, is from our own Empower team. His name is CHEN, and some of you already know who he is. He's been married to his lovely wife, Yin, for 14 years. He has 2 kids, Caleb, aged 11, and Olivia, aged 7. And he runs his own business in Rowville. And he's just going to be sharing his experience with supporting his wife through anxiety. So this is coming from what are some tips or some advice in terms of supporting someone through mental health as well. So, Joe, I'll pass it over to you.
Cool, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, so I'm just going to share a bit of my story of supporting my wife through her anxiety, and hopefully my hope and prayer is that will encourage some people, some men here today. Before we sort of get started, I'd just like to take a quick poll of people within this group here. So what I want you to do, if you can sort of hit the reactions and hit the thumbs up button or some sort of reaction there, if you have ever taken on, currently or have in the past taken on the role of supporting or caring someone with a mental illness. It could be a family member, life group member, a friend, or even a workmate, just somebody. Just put your thumbs up there. So we've got, the tree. I think you see that, Josh, Danny, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Wow, it's huge. 14 out of 34. So all close to 50% of us have had to fulfill that sort of role. So a bit of my story. For me, before my wife was diagnosed with anxiety, I had no idea about mental illness, how it could affect people. It just wasn't on my radar, and it was just something which I was just completely unaware of, and it certainly did affect our marriage. You see, my wife is actually prone to a type of anxiety where it's associated with what we call catastrophic thinking. So in particular, she was, and still is today, very concerned about the safety of the family. So what that means is that when I would forget, to do things like keep the family safe by locking the side gate or close the garage door, it would trigger her anxiety. Her mind would just immediately race, think of the worst case scenario that could possibly happen, such as a criminal, psychotic killer coming into our house and murdering all of our family while we're sleeping in bed. Admittedly, I do tend to be absent-minded and forgetful at times, and so this would lead to moments of conflict in our marriage, where she would think that, I just don't care for the family, and I would sort of respond by thinking that she was overreacting, she was attacking and accusing me during these situations, and I would respond by withdrawing and becoming defensive. During that initial stage, I was filled with confusion, frustration, and even anger during those times. I felt helpless, and I just didn't know what to do. So this went on for some time, and it peaked at about in August 2014. And at this time, Daniel was talking about physical symptoms, right? My wife was getting heart palpitations, chest pain, breathlessness, night sweats, ringing in the ears, and other sort of symptoms. And so she went to see a GP, and they did a full assessment, checked all her health, put a 24-hour heart monitor, and did a whole bunch of tests. And basically the conclusion, physical health was perfectly fine. So they did other sort of tests, a mental health assessment, and she was finally diagnosed with general anxiety disorder and panic, and burnout with the risk of developing depression. So in some ways it wasn't good news, right? But at the same time it was kind of a relief to know that, what are we dealing with here? And we were able to get the help that we needed. So, after months of counselling with a Christian psychologist and implementing strategies, things began to improve. Along the way, I completed a mental health first aid course, and God used this experience to open my eyes and help me to see and understand what my wife was going through. I learned some of the things that I was saying and doing that weren't helpful, and the things that were helpful. One of the biggest things for me that changed was validating my wife's feelings. I used to get really annoyed, frustrated when my wife would express certain negative emotions. I'm like, why do you feel that way? It just didn't make sense to me. And then I would react by becoming defensive and withdrawing. So instead of, I'm still learning to acknowledge those negative feelings, validate them, and try to see them as like a signal that she's trying to communicate to me that, something's wrong. It's certainly not easy, but with God's grace, things have definitely improved, and within my wife herself, and also within our marriage relationship as well. I must also say that one of the greatest helps has been our church community. I want to acknowledge people like, Tang and Amanda, David and Kit, and others in our life group who've just been an incredible blessing. I believe God has made us for community, and that each of us can't be all that He's made us to be without community, without each other. That He's placed us in this community. And I want to take this, just finish off just by saying that I want to encourage those men who are currently caring for someone and supporting someone with a mental illness. So first and foremost, I just want to say that you're not alone. Don't ever think you're alone, right? You're not alone. Reach out to someone that you trust. Get the help that you need. It could be someone within the church community, your GP, a friend, someone you trust. And secondly, get equipped. Do a mental health first aid course. Find out about these conditions. It will open your eyes to recognize that mental illness is just as real as a physical illness, and just as debilitating. And it really helped change my perspectives, and it can help change yours as well. And you'll be able to help and support your loved one or a friend. And thirdly, most importantly, seek God. We can't underestimate the power of God. He's the one who walked with us through that valley of the shadow of death. We can trust Him. And I've seen people in deep depression, not coming out of the house for 2 years, and they've been, miraculously changed by God and healed by God. We need to, first of all, put God and trust in Him first and foremost. I just really hope that my story has kind of helped some of you, and that for those in that who are taking on that caring role. Thanks again for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe. That was really good. And I think when you shared about some of the feelings that your wife was going through and how you were feeling as well, I think a lot of us were just nodding and identifying exactly that's how we feel the same way when we're supporting our loved ones through mental health issues. And I think yeah, it was really helpful. And I just thought, I wrote in the chat, that mental health course, I thought that was very proactive of you to do that. And I would never thought of that. So that was really good that you were able to share that. And if you're able to find that link, maybe if you could put it in the chat or something, that would be really helpful. So we're going to move to a time of Q&A. And in terms of our session. So I'm just going to open up the floor for anyone. If you've got any questions specifically for Joe, Danny, or Andrew, in terms of mental health or any questions you might have, and I might actually pass it to Joe first because there's a question from Patrick. But I'd really encourage you to write any questions that you have in the chat, and Joe and I will be facilitating this kind of time here. So if you've got any questions around Danny's content or Andrew's story or Joe's, please write it in the chat, and then we'll just see if we can filter through those. But yeah, again, thank you, Joe, so much for your sharing. Really valuable, and to all our panelists, actually. Well, I thought I might ask this question to you, Joe. This is from Patrick. He said, what fundamentally triggered her anxiety in terms of Yun's journey?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, first of all, she does have a family history, so we know that there is sometimes some genetic components there. But we did some quite extensive counselling, and it actually came back to one critical event, key event in her childhood, where she actually witnessed her aunt attempt suicide by trying to take pills, and that sort of traumatized her. She was quite young at that time. She didn't really understand what was going on, and at that time she was actually caring for her younger cousins, so she's almost taken on from that almost like a rescue mentality, where if someone's in trouble, she used to basically go out of her way to try and rescue people, and that's also where a lot of the catastrophic thinking has come from as well. That's probably one of the key sort of events in her life that had led to that situation.
I might just jump in there and just to speak to, I guess, anxiety in general in terms of perhaps some of the underlying themes that are common. I think everyone's experience is a little bit different in terms of the specific stories, but there are some common themes. The two simple ways to understand, I guess, causes of anxieties would be this: one, having a previous negative experience can make you fearful about the future. So using a very simple analogy, you've the first time you board a plane, and then the plane, you experience a lot of turbulence and you feel out of control and you feel really fearful. That can set up perhaps your worry about flying in the future. So a past negative experience, as what Joe shared, can perhaps set certain habits or patterns of thinking and reacting even in future situations that it might be different, but it could have established a certain template of working. The second area is this balance or this gap between perhaps capacity and expectation. Again, I'm going to use perhaps a very simple analogy. So, for example, if you give, so all of us need to perhaps experience a gap between expectation and capacity to help us grow and develop. So, at the end of grade 1, you start introducing perhaps an entry level to grade 2 math level for a student to help them learn. You wouldn't be giving them the same material at the start of the year. You give them something a little bit more to challenge them, to help them grow. But if the end of grade 1, you introduce grade 6 math, that's perhaps setting expectations that are beyond the person's capacity, and that gap, that huge gap, the wider that gap, the greater the experience of anxiety might be. So obviously, if you're suffering from quite significant problems, please seek some specific help to unpack different things. It's not as simple as that, but just generally speaking, if we can do two things. One, perhaps adjust and modify our expectations, either whether it's imposed externally, or perhaps expectations that we place on ourselves. That can help reduce that gap. The second thing is perhaps doing practical things to improve our capacity to be able to meet those expectations. So such as kind of learning ways to cope, perhaps learning to problem solve, learning to prioritize, those sort of things improve our capacity. And the other bit in terms of perhaps being able to manage expectations is a huge part of helping with anxiety as well. So, there may be so many different applications of this, but generally that would be the principle in terms of being able to perhaps reduce that gap.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Danny. And Joe,
Yep. So Danny, Andrew's got a question.
That's really helpful.
Sorry, I'll just go here. So to Danny, would you recommend any specific resources?
Joe, I think you're.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep. Sorry.
You can hear me? Okay. Yeah. So Danny, Andrew's got a question for you. Would you recommend any specific resources or services for international students in Australia who may be suffering from mental health issues and they don't necessarily have any access to Medicare funding, and especially those whose English may not be that great?
Yeah, look, there's often gaps in but I guess just in terms of a few things, if someone's in university, usually there is a reasonable amount of support provided within the university psychological services. So sometimes they also have, say, psychology students running clinics in universities that might be free of charge for perhaps people that can't afford to pay through the Medicare system. So the university often has student support services that can be very helpful. Also, all high schools actually have well-being teams in place internally with the school that can provide that kind of perhaps first level of support. The other things, there are a number of actually some online resources that are available, and sometimes for the majority of people, a lot of self-help resources can be quite available. So if you could, the two perhaps platforms that'd be quite easy in terms of looking for support. One is headspace.org.au, and that's great support for youth mental health. They also offer online counseling as well through eHeadspace, but as well as links to a number of online resources to help you with anxiety, depression, some practical tips, and links to other web tools that can be also easily accessible. Obviously, there may be times when people might need some more additional help, and I think that's a bit more complicated from a financial insurance kind of perspective. But these are some perhaps simple ways to access help within the current system for those who may find it a bit difficult. There are some materials that are translated into other languages, but it is a bit limited in terms of if your first language is in English. But I guess some creative ways that I've tried to get around that is using Google Translate and interpreters and various things like that to be able to access that help.
Okay, for the next question here, we've got, let's see, from Mike. Can you suggest some ways to support teenage grandchildren suffering from anxiety and depression? So we know, so maybe it's not really directed at anyone, but I think probably Danny would be the most qualified to take this one.
Oh, look, I think there are lots of different things, and maybe I can kind of talk about it in terms of perhaps a bit of a sense of a hierarchy. So perhaps at a very practical level, I think keeping in mind that when people struggle with anxiety and depression, we are all still fundamentally human beings, and all human beings want to feel like they're loved, they belong, they're valued, and they're respected. So this is really something that could be applied to any situation, whether it's grandchildren or perhaps caring for other people and so forth, and thinking a bit about what kind of things we can do that actually helps to achieve those outcomes, feeling loved, feeling that you belong, feeling that you're accepted, feeling that you can connect. So whatever practical things at that level would be really important in terms of getting that kind of help. The second thing really is trying to perhaps obviously, I'm assuming the grandchildren, there are also parents involved, unless perhaps there may be some grandparents who are the primary carers for kids as well. So there may be different situations, but really, in terms of helping children and young people with anxiety and depression, the family is actually the greatest resource. So typically when, so I work in a child and youth mental health service, seeing patients aged 0 to 25. Often people make referrals to us, whether it's their GP or their family or the school. And typically we invite actually the whole family to come in as part of that support, because we really, family relationships are really the essential ingredient in terms of a resource for recovery. And so being able to do things like maintain routines as much as possible, and to kind of have that support structure in place. And the other thing that often comes up really is knowing, especially for teenagers, knowing when to actually listen and knowing when to give advice. And for the majority of the cases, situations, especially for older teenagers, spending more time listening would actually kind of be the first, maybe spending even 70% of the time listening rather than necessarily jumping on to giving advice, because often the problems aren't really straightforward and simple and practical. And what often is needed is this sense of being able to feel heard. And then Joe talked about being able to validate someone's feelings, being able to actually acknowledge what they might be feeling rather than jumping into a problem solving sort of mode. The other thing is that sometimes I guess I'm just speaking generally, that there may be situations where there could be a lot of conflict and stress and tension in the family. Sometimes grandparents can be a really great resource to provide a bit of a respite or a break for everyone, to kind of have the weekend at a grandparents' place, going for a bit of an outing or barbecue where we can, and making some kind of kind of respite or breaks that are actually predictable and regular, so that you're not necessarily doing that break because of a problem, but in the midst of the chaos and stress and tension, there's something positive that they can look forward to that's on a regular basis, that gives everybody a bit of a break as well. And so looking at kind of the family resource, spending time listening, having regular opportunities for connection, and also there may be times, I guess, that there may be scope to actually seek some professional help, particularly if the problem is pretty enduring.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danny. Got one from Colin, who's mentioned, Danny, could you comment on the impact of just social media and anxiety and depression? And I guess you could relate it to, both men, but also maybe family as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, look, I could probably spend another few hours talking about this particular topic, but it is absolutely significant. I think a few things, that there is this sense of, social media can be a very helpful way to connect, send positive messages, to create networks and opportunities for people as well, but often that what we see on social media may not actually represent the whole kind of picture. So, and that can often give a very skewed perspective and create a sense of comparison, competition, and so forth. And that can actually have a very significant impact on the sense of anxiety and depression, a sense of perhaps affect someone's self-esteem, a sense of self-worth, and so forth. So perhaps, if going back to what I was talking about in terms of our identity, our identity could be tied up in terms of how many friends we have, how many posts we have, how many likes we have, and how people view us. A bit like what I was talking about, the reputation, and making sure that while we make use of these tools, rather than to have these tools dictate who we are as people in terms of our identity, and also particularly our sense of reputation. Another part is also that sometimes in social media, it can be a very high risk situation in terms of impact on someone's reputation. So in the past, we all make mistakes. We say the wrong thing. We might have offended someone. And, typically if you go and meet 2 or 3 people and say the wrong thing, and then that's the end of it. But on social media, because it's so visible and so it could spread so easily, that increases the vulnerability in terms of affecting someone's reputation. And as I was saying earlier, that things that affect someone's reputation can actually significantly impact on their mental health, and particularly the risk of suicide is absolutely significant in terms of when, you know, people, we all make mistakes, but when people are caught out and it's all over social media, that can be a very high risk situation. So as a community, I think it's really important, let's be quite thoughtful and careful about what we post online, but also what we choose to share and pass on as well, in terms of sometimes we can get caught up in tabloids or news and rumors, and then, you know, let's kind of do the right thing and not participate in some of those things that perpetuate some of those challenges and difficulties. But also at a very kind of practical level, I think the use of electronics can also, for prolonged periods, can affect our concentration, attention, and also makes it difficult to, actually significantly affects our sleep. And obviously I work with children and teenagers, and with the increased amount of time or screen time based on the remote schooling and also social activities that happen online as well, I'm seeing a higher rates of sleep difficulties in children and adolescents, and I think this is also relevant in all of us as people. So what similarly, for just speaking personally, I'm obviously doing a lot more of these talks online, or I do a lot of work on telehealth as well, and spending a lot of time on the computer. So at the end of the day, I try and actually go for a walk, and, you know, even if the neighborhood's boring, do something a bit different that's off technology that really helps. I think very simple, practical things that helps us manage some of the issues about technology, and getting that balance right as well.
Thanks, Danny. That's really helpful. We missed a question from Pastor Greg, actually, which was actually directed at me. What were some of the things that you put in place to care for yourself as a carer? So a lot of the things that Danny sort of mentioned about, taking care of yourself physically, getting enough sleep. I would go for runs. I think and he mentioned the importance of communicating and having that support. And I think going back again to that community support from Life Group and from Teng and Amanda and somebody I could trust and really be open and honest about what I was going through or what was happening. And so I think that was probably one of the biggest things for me that sort of helped get through that period of time. So for those who, I just can't stress enough, you just can't go through something like that alone. You need to build up a community of support because no man is an island. So we're made for community. Yep. Okay. Next question, Age.
Yeah, awesome. So I've got one here from Teng, and it's saying, is there such thing as a low-level depression where you feel flat but are actually still high functioning?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I think there's a few things to this. One, depending on our usual coping skills and various other resources around us, sometimes people might be actually struggling more than it's apparent. So sometimes when, somebody may actually might be used to kind of perhaps faking it and not faking it in a bad way, but really kind of in this pretend mode and trying your best and you just do your best on the external part of you to meet expectations. It can be quite difficult to perhaps appreciate the level of difficulty inside. So I would kind of perhaps think about that. Maybe it's not necessarily a low level depression, but perhaps it's less apparent to others and even to oneself too. So just really wanting to acknowledge that rather than trying to work out what is low, medium, or high, to acknowledge that if there are difficulties, that we should kind of all put in place the things that we've talked about in terms of getting that help and support, ranging from kind of that our community practical help to actually getting some professional help. Sometimes if you're not sure, going to see a professional to get it checked out, even to be reassured, is also a good outcome of going to seek help. You don't have to know that you definitely have depression before getting help. It's important even if you've got questions and queries, to actually explore that rather than wait till it's severe. And the earlier that we get help, the more likely the help is going to be more effective, and also it would take less time to recover if you get help early as well.
Well, thank you, Danny. I might actually pass it on to Andrew. So, Andrew, in terms of that question there with what Tang was asking about, about low level and and high functioning still, how did you know when you needed to get help? Like, what was the position where you thought, I actually need to get help and reach out?
I guess the short answer was when I sort of struggled to get through day by day.
Yeah.
Probably what was happening for a little while. I was having thoughts of ending my life for a little while, for a few weeks, and that was, I guess, another signal of getting
Yeah.
help.
Yeah.
To be honest, I probably should have sought help a lot earlier than that. But it's a lot of sort of man thing. You don't admit you're weak, or everybody else is suffering, or what or trivializing what I was going through.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point in terms of, I know, for us to find out those signs or being a bit more self-aware, right? Especially during this time with isolation and the pandemic, and almost reassessing ourselves to know when we need to seek help and put those things in place. Joe, did you want to take the next one?
Yeah, so we've got a question from Paul for Danny. So how do you know if someone's going to follow through with threats of suicide or self-harm? Would you treat all threats with the same sense of urgency?
Yeah, look, that's a really great question. A very common dilemma, or a question that comes up. Obviously, as a mental health professional specialist, one of the things I have to do is kind of work out, at what point someone can be adequately just supported within the community who might need more specific professional help, and also there might be times when people might need additional help, such as being in hospital or getting some additional support. And obviously there are pros and cons in terms of those different levels of support, and getting that right fit at different times is part of the complex job that I have. So I probably won't spend time explaining the difference from that perspective, but to let you know that a mental health professional's job is to sort of work out and tease out some of those differences. But generally speaking, I guess I would think about the fact that if anyone is struggling with any spectrum of thoughts of self-harm or suicide, it means they're actually distressed. And it's really important that we support that person to get help. And it's probably indicating that it's perhaps beyond a level that a lay person should be supporting someone in. It doesn't mean that after getting help from a professional, you can still provide that lay general support. But it's important that that's not just sitting with perhaps a lay person that's not necessarily trained, depending on your level of training and so forth. So if I really encourage to treat those situations with a sense of I guess seriousness, rather than necessarily urgency. Sometimes if we panic and react to something, sometimes that can be counterproductive, but really treat all situations as serious, and encouraging someone to get help, and not just dealing with it at a lay level without professional input if there are those situations in place. But it may be that some of these situations could be quite chronic, and we need to kind of get that balance right in terms of what level supports that might be, but that's probably best determined by a mental health a clinician or person. But for everyone here, I think if you are encountering those situations, a few practical tips are very helpful. Quite similar to what Joe was sharing around, making sure that as a person on the receiving end of the information, that's level of support, making sure that you are perhaps looking after your own self-care, that you are having appropriate boundaries. You're not necessarily taking phone calls and messages from someone 24 hours a day. Really encourage them to use the crisis support lines if they require that level of support. And then also, thinking about how do you encourage that person to actually seek the help that they might need through the avenues that we spoke about earlier. So that would be my kind of general tips, I guess, in terms of approaching that situation.
Yeah, that's really good. Especially, I think it touches on what Joe was talking about, self-care, and knowing that boundary of when you need to take care of yourself, but also take care of that person as well, and when to direct them to professional help. I've got a question from Andrew as well here. What have church communities done well in supporting people with mental illnesses? What have church communities done poorly, and what could have done better? So,
yeah, great question. There are lots of things that are being done very well. I think the fact that as a church and a community you're talking about this, and I imagine the fact that you're organizing this talk is sort of almost like a tip of the iceberg, in that you've had lots of other conversations and activities along the way that then makes it safe to have this conversation. So in terms of the level of preparedness, I imagine a lot of things that have happened as a church. So at a broader having leadership that supports this conversation is absolutely important, because that sets the foundations for the church and the modeling that helps to reduce that stigma. The second thing is, having people speak out about their lived experience is so powerful, particularly when somebody is in a position of influence, such as a leader, that then helps to carry a very positive message, providing doing things like the psychological first aid, or even training like this, and general education is also another helpful part of this, and then making it a bit of a norm in terms of what we do day to day. I guess some of the areas I think we could grow a bit better at as a church is, sometimes as Christians we may not be, we don't, maybe we don't I don't want to overgeneralize. Sometimes I think we could do better in terms of the way that we have more direct and assertive conversations with people. Sometimes we might kind of, beat around the bush, or kind of go around and spend a long time talking around the problem, rather than actually talking about the issue and actually addressing things a bit more assertively and clearly. And also perhaps we are very we share testimonies of joy and hope and all that, which is great. But sometimes it's important to actually share the journey that someone might be going through as well. And for example, not just sharing testimonies of the end point of the victory, but to actually be able to share the journey and experience and what God is doing for someone during the journey, because all of us would walk a journey, and that different people might have different experiences in terms of outcomes and successes. So I think sometimes that can be a lot of to come testimony time. We share a lot of the God has blessed me and I've got this victory, but actually the testimony is in God's goodness throughout our suffering as well, and being able to get that perspective. Another thing I think that some of the things that perhaps we could also do better as church community is some of the non-verbal stuff. We generally don't go and tell somebody we don't like them. We sometimes roll our eyes when somebody shares for too long in a connect group. Sometimes we don't invite them to the coffee. We invite some people. I'm just going to speak from my personal experience. I've observed in places as well where you invite 3/4 of the group except for a couple of people, and because it's not an official church event, we haven't invited them. I think we need to kind of perhaps grow away from some of those behaviors that I think are not necessarily intentional. They can creep into the way that we operate sometimes, and it's not a criticism on anyone, but I think I'm just speaking from things that I've also kind of grown and learned from as well. And the other thing is, sometimes perhaps from wherever messaging that we add to the other areas, in terms of the area of prayer, and being quite clear about what is it that we're praying for and how we're praying for these situations, being quite thoughtful around it. And one typical example would be to try and avoid, in the same line, praying for mental health issues and crime, as if, because I know it's not intended that way, but sometimes that can imply that they are actually kind of related. This is an example of some basic things that might kind of create some sense of stigma.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. That's really, really helpful. I've got a deep question here. Headspace seems to be for youth, a lifeline for more crisis, suicidal thoughts, and I'm neither case, I suppose. Would you recommend contacting Beyond Blue? I just want to understand the fundamental reasons for my depression and learn to deal with it. I'm not sure if the GP is specialised enough to help. I'm proactively telling people around me about my problem, but I'm trying to come up with further action points.
Look, that's a great question. Look, what I might do is I'll send through to Adrian a list of resources that I sent to my church. So there's a list of resources for different age groups. So it includes Beyond Blue, the Black Dot Institute. It has links to some different resources and supports, but also some online web tools for self-help. So there's a whole range of different things for different age groups as well. Sorry, I missed out a couple of other things, but there is a whole range of different supports out there. I might send it off to Adrian so you can forward that on and both in terms of links and also web tools. And also your GP can actually, your GP will be the central point in terms of making referrals to Medicare funded services. The government recently, so they fund 10 psychological sessions, but for the next 2 years, they've extended that to 20 sessions. So you'll be able to access more psychological support. So generally the GP can help, but the process will be to go through your GP. And another important part of seeing your GP is because particularly for men, there's a lot of other physical health issues that may or may not be related as part of this. And so getting health checks is also a very important part of this as well. Thank you for the question. I think that was really helpful in terms of pointing out in terms of the different supports needed for different age groups, but I'll send through some resources.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll pass it on. And it was really good to know about the mental health sessions from the GP. I didn't actually know that, and that they're actually extending it to 20 sessions. Did you say, Danny?
Yeah. So that's just been recently announced by the federal government in the context of the pandemic. The only tricky thing is there aren't twice the number of psychologists available suddenly. So I think it's going to take a bit of time to grow the workforce, but this is quite positive in terms of being able to increase that access and additional help. And it's per calendar year. So I think in the 1st of January, it will reset again too. So so it's obviously there's no perfect system. Sometimes when you try and get help, it doesn't quite work out. Don't give up. There is a generally reasonably adequate system. I think in Australia, the mental health care is pretty good in contrast to a number of other countries and various places I've done these talks at, where actually a significant part of the professional counseling falls onto the pastoral care staff. But so we have pretty good systems. It's not perfect. I just want to be real about that. And if it doesn't quite work out, don't give up. Try again. Ask someone to help you navigate that. And often, your GP might be a good point, or perhaps a friend, and even looking at websites and stuff to get that right help. So just wanted to acknowledge that sometimes there's a lot of great resources, but sometimes it is a little bit confusing and not perfect. But don't give up trying. If something doesn't work out, try again.
Yeah, that sounds really good. I might just ask one more question, Danny, and this is also to the group as well before we finish up and wrap up. Can I just, if you could just add in a reaction, maybe just a thumbs up again, if anyone has a regular catch up with someone that they're into, that side-by-side conversation that someone's that Danny talked about that you can speak to. Can you put a thumbs up? I'm just curious to see how many people are actually having regular catch-ups with someone. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, let's see again. 5, 6, 7. Yeah, 8. Great. So it's about maybe a third of us, actually, a bit over a third of us having these conversations. Danny, I'm just wondering, maybe as we finish up, just this last question about, where we've acknowledged that as guys, we need to open up avenues of communication, and we often have it by side. Do you have any tips or what you've seen work really well for guys who are in isolation and restrictions, or even things that you're doing at the moment to encourage those side-by-side conversations?
Yeah, I think it goes back to something I was talking about. Earlier about our expectations about from those opportunities and relationships. Sometimes we end up finding a best buddy, someone that we can really connect with, but it's okay to actually just catch up and have a coffee and just talk about some things in general. It doesn't always have to be super deep, meaningful conversations, and it doesn't have to be intense relationships. So you catch up with the same person every week with a commitment to do that for the next 5 years. It's not it doesn't look. There are times we do have friendships that are really deep and meaningful and in that sort of way, but if all our relationships like that, it sounds pretty intense. So I think it's good to have a variety of different relationships and just about what we expect. So I know I know that a number of people in my life group are struggling with certain challenges at the moment due to lockdown. So I did try to we can go for a walk. They live in my 5K. So, why don't we just go for a walk? I don't know the person very well, apart from, you know, in life group, and I don't have a lot of similar interests, but you know, we both can walk.
Yeah.
You know, so there are things that we can, you know, I think one of the things about this lockdown is it's reduced us to some of the basic things that we can all do. And so and I think sometimes we try and look for activities that's super fun, like, you know, we're going to go bungee jumping, we're going to go and do this, but actually there is this routine and mundaneness of life that we want to kind of be able to manage. That's really important, and not just seek the next coolest thing, or the, you know, just making sure that we perhaps manage our expectations in that space so that we can actually do this realistically and sustainably. Because it's I think sometimes when we try and invest into really intense relationships, it's difficult to sustain, and that's when that's when people get hurt.
Yeah, definitely. That's some really good advice. And just, I guess, with the expectations, you know, keeping it simple. Yeah, no, really good. Well, we're about to finish. I might pass it over to Frank, who will just share a bit more about our next events and also close up in prayer. So Frank, I'll pass it over to you. Still on mute at the moment, Frank.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Got ya. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Dr. Danny, and thank you, the panel speakers, Joe, and the other person, I forget, and
Andrew. Yeah.
Andrew. Sorry, Andrew, I just get misplaced with your name. Sorry about that. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Joe, and also thank you, Dr. Danny, for your valuable insight onto this issue of mental health. And thanks everyone for attending this Empower event. I hope that this has been a time where it's been beneficial for every one of us over here. And I also want to thank each of the men on the panel today for sharing their stories, and for Dr. Danny for sharing his expertise in this area. For those who are interested in the future events of the Empower, you can please email us at empower@claytonchurch.org.au. We are holding our final event on Saturday, the 5th of December, between 2 and 3:30 p.m. So please lock in this date and be tuned in, as more details will be announced in the next few weeks. We would also appreciate if you could spend a few minutes to click on the feedback link in the Zoom chat. Your feedback link is invaluable to us. We as the Empower team do look at the feedback, and it makes a difference to shape this men's ministry. This is your ministry, and we are here to serve you. So please give your thoughts on how to make this ministry better. Thanks once again for everyone tuning in, and we have been so blessed to have you here. And please let us now close our eyes and pray and thank God for what He has done for us this afternoon. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you and praise you for all that you have done for us this afternoon. Thank you for Dr. Danny. Thank you for the panel speakers. Thank you for each participant, Lord. Thank you for the insight that each of us has received on this mental issue, Father. And Lord, as we receive this understanding and knowledge, we just pray, God, that you will enable each one of us to use this information for your greater glory, Lord, for those who are going through a difficult time. Lord, we just thank you for what you have in store for each one of us. We thank you, Lord, that you're doing great and wonderful things, even in this difficult situation. Lord, we know that you have everything under your control, oh God, and nothing in our life happens without your permission. Father, we thank you and we praise you for the life that we have in you. Lord, life in abundance, because you have come that each of us might have life and life in its fullness, oh Lord. We just want to thank you for this afternoon, and I thank you for each and every brother of mine that has joined us this afternoon. Lord, we just want to give you praise, glory, and honor. In the mighty and holy name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Frank. And again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and again to our panel speakers. If you want to be involved in Empower or help us out with running these events, please keep in touch with us. And if you've wanted any support with prayer, please let us know. You can email us at the email before that Frank sent out, or we'll send out an email again anyway with all the resources. But if you want to get involved or you want to be connected with some prayer, please let us know how we can support you. But well, thank you so much, guys, and have an awesome evening tonight. Thank you.